It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Craig McKinley, the SNP's Kirsten Oswald, the Daily Mail's political editor John Stevens and Guardian columnist Gabby Hinsliff. Today,
people will be surprised to learn that European judges are overturning British judges' decisions.
This is a distraction. It creates a row actually that the government admitted that they knew that they would have.
European judges prevent this plane taking asylum seekers to Rwanda.
So let's call a spade a spade. This is illegal.
The EU launches legal action against the UK over changes to the Brexit deal.
Scotland now and for the generations that come after us deserves the very best, and independence is how we can secure that.
Nicola Sturgeon wants another referendum, but will the Prime Minister allow one to happen?
The decision was taken by the Scottish people only a few years ago. In recent memory, I think we should respect that.
And his deputy told me he should give it a bit more welly. Keir Starmer takes on Boris Johnson in PMQs. We'll bring you that live at noon. Well, you heard the Commission Vice President, Maros Sefcovic, there in the headlines talking about legal action. Let's just show you the story in BBC News. EU takes new legal action against UK over post-Brexit deal changes. We left the EU more than 2 years ago. Craig, are we forever going to be having rows with Europe?
We needn't, because Europe ought to be coming to the table and actually solving a problem. And there is a problem with the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's not working as everybody thought it might. It does not have support by the unionist community. That's very, very clear. And we will not have an assembly reforming until there's changes to the east-west flow of goods and traffic. So it's not working. And funnily enough, the protocol itself had its own salvation within. It had an Article 13.8. It allows for changes as and when necessary.
So why didn't you go for those first?
We've been trying for 18 months, over 300 hours of talks. And Sefcovic, who just had the piece on, all he can say is, I don't have the mandate. We'll get the mandate, come back to the table, and let's sort out this problem. Are we really arguing over the protection of the single market, which the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill does nothing to upset at all? It secures and safeguards that. We need some common sense. And also within the, the withdrawal agreement itself.
Safeguard it without checks?
Well, there will be checks.
Right.
Even the proposal that has been put forward under the NIP bill has the green and red channels. There will be checks where appropriate for any goods that are likely to pass across into the,
just before I ask the others, Craig, do you think the government should have had guarantees from the Democratic Unionist Party that they would definitely go back into power sharing as this legislation by the government was introduced?
Well, I can't speak for the DUP, but
they don't have those guarantees.
I think their concerns are that the bill as published is the high watermark. It usually gets weaker from there because of opposition within the Commons and then what might happen in the Lords. So this is the high watermark. It'll only get weaker. All
right, let's bring in the others. My question actually was, are we going to be having rows with Europe and the EU forever, Kirsten?
Well, you know, in this situation, I'm not surprised that the commentators in Europe are looking on askance, and I'm not surprised at what we heard there. But you know, the reason that we're here, the reason that this challenge, as Craig would have it, is before us, is because the UK government don't know which way's up. They're all over the place here. They have been all over the place.
They've been quite clear, I think, haven't they? You may not like it, but they have been quite clear about what they want.
Well, I don't think they've been clear at all. You know, this is their own selves that they're arguing against, for goodness sake. You know, they have put themselves in this position. They're now arguing about it. They're picking a fight with Europe. I think that it's not unreasonable that the EU want to make sure that they keep a reasonably firm grip on their position.
Do you think it's working then? Do you think it's working, the Northern Ireland Protocol, the arrangement, the post-Brexit trade arrangements for Northern Ireland?
Do you know, I think Brexit's caused all kinds of challenges in all kinds of ways.
But do you think the protocol's working?
Do you know, I think that there are pros and cons there. It's, I have to say, a really unedifying situation, though, that we're here because the UK government could not get itself into a sensible position. It now can't hold its own position. It is arguing against itself, as it seems to do on an awful lot of issues to do with Brexit. It certainly hasn't got Brexit done as it would have it. And I think that people across the world, actually further beyond than Europe, will be looking and thinking, what on earth is going on here? What a shambles.
John? The Mail's deputy political editor, promoting you, live on air there. I mean, are we going to be having, or is the UK government going to be forever having rows with Europe?
Well, you hear both sides. You hear the UK side. They say their preference isn't to use this Northern Ireland Protocol bill. They say they prefer to negotiate a solution. You hear from the EU side. They also say that rather than taking the UK to court over this, they would prefer to see a negotiated solution. But you look at what's moved over the last 18 months, and it isn't that much. We don't seem to have made an awful lot of progress. But I think you see the EU today, they're kind of trying to use this carrot and stick approach, saying, you know, the stick is if you do this, we will take legal action. The carrot is they are saying that they're going to come up with some new possible solutions to move things forward.
Gabby?
I think we're going to be arguing about it for as long as it takes to unravel the sort of core untruth, I suppose, at the heart of that original Brexit deal, which was the argument that you don't have to have borders, we can do this without borders, you don't have to have a hard border on the island of Ireland, you don't have to have a border down the sea. Well, it turns out that you do. And as that sort of was fudged and glossed over in the original Brexit deal, I think we're now going to have to go through the hard yards of you know, working out how we actually practically resolve that.
And we're going to be talking about borders a little later on in terms of an independent Scotland or a referendum being held, which is what Nicola Sturgeon would like. Let me just show you this front page, the Daily Mail. This is following the news last night that the flight to Rwanda to take a number of asylum seekers was grounded. The headline in the Daily Mail says, Eurocourt grounds jet to Rwanda. The Mirror has a different angle and headline, Rwanda flight grounded. What a cruel farce. Are you disappointed or pleased that the flight to Rwanda didn't take off last night?
Well, what do you think? I'm very, very disappointed. I mean, this whole issue had been through the courts of the UK up to the highest level, the Supreme Court, yesterday afternoon. And we've got a judge in chambers in Strasbourg has effectively overruled what our Parliament wants, the government wants, and I think overwhelmingly what the public want. We need to get a grip on this irregular migration. I don't think the Rwanda deal is the ideal one. Do you know what the ideal one is? Is for the French government to accept that broad and expansive offer we gave them to say if you're struggling to patrol your beaches, stopping the beach, coming off the beach in dinghies, how much help do you need? We will give you army, police, border force. That is the way within a fortnight we can stop these irregular crossings, stop the illegal people traffickers and save lives. We seem to be forgetting here, we're trying to save lives by stopping this traffic.
Sorry.
The Rwanda deal is meant to stop that by putting that sort of risk in the way to any who are attempting it.
Yeah, well, so far
you may end up in Rwanda rather than the UK.
Well, so far, of course, the first flight hasn't gone. In terms of Parliament support this idea, the public supports this idea. Is Craig right?
No, I don't think he is right. And for Craig to try and characterise this as in some way looking after the welfare of people is quite extraordinary, actually. You're not looking after the welfare of anyone when you do this. All you're doing is making people who are in the most vulnerable situations
in France,
imaginable.
In France, are they?
If I can continue, because I allowed you to, letting these people who are in the most vulnerable situations get into a situation where you're then criminalising them, sending them to Rwanda. You know, where are their rights in all of this? Where is their welfare and well-being in all of this? What we really need to do is to take a step back and look at the human beings that are at the centre of all of this, people who are fleeing from desperate situations, and consider whether we maybe have a duty to look after them in a better and a different way. And I have to say, Scotland is ready to do that. We are absolutely open to refugees. I think that the approach that the UK government has taken is cruel. I think it's absolutely unnecessary, and it's also an extraordinary waste of money. A flight which didn't take off has cost just as much as it would have done if that flight had taken off.
You're nodding away. Is it a waste of money?
Well, no, it's not a waste of money. This is an outcome. We're spending close to £2 billion a year in hotel costs borne by the British public. We have got the likelihood of 100,000 illegal incursions this year. I mean, I'd ask Kirsten, on behalf of Scotland, there are 65 million people who are displaced around this world at the moment, and many hundreds of millions more, for economic reasons, would rather be somewhere else. Does Scotland want all of those? Can it take all of those? Or do we have to have a managed system that works?
Are you suggesting that it wouldn't be a sensible thing for all of the governments, including the UK government, to step up to the mark? Because I think that that's what's needed here. All governments need to step up to the mark to consider that there is an issue here. Yeah. People are displaced around the world. That bit's true.
And would you have a limit at all?
Well, Scotland does have space for more people. We do have space for refugees to come, and we do have a very different approach and a different outlook to how we deal with these things. You just have to look at some of the citizen-led activity, like the people in Kenmure Street in Pollokshields who stopped people from being removed from their community. Absolutely. So, I think that there is a different perspective, but the way the UK government is going about this is not only a terrible waste of money, it's a really, really shameful way to behave.
All right, we're going to look into it a little bit more. Let's talk to Joshua Rosenberg, legal commentator. Joshua, it was legal action by lawyers and campaigners on behalf of the 7 people who were due to be sent to Rwanda last night, and the European Court of Human Rights intervening to stop one and then granting injunctions against the removal of several more that meant it was grounded. Is there any way, short of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, of preventing judges in Strasbourg ruling on what happens in the UK?
No, there's not, short of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. We are a member of the Council of Europe. Among 46 countries, there were 47, but Russia was expelled recently. This is nothing, of course, to do with the other European Court you were discussing in your first item. This is nothing to do with the EU. So long as we are part of the Council of Europe, we will be signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights. And so long as we are signed up to the European Convention, we respect the court's request. It is only a request for what it calls interim measures, this very rare procedure whereby it tells a government, asks a government, depending which way you look at it, not to do something which the government wants to do.
All right, let me just read you and our viewers this tweet by Greg Smith, Conservative MP. There have been multiple occasions this Parliament has passed legislation with great speed. What last night showed is we now need the same speed and urgency to bring in a UK Bill of Rights and remove all power of the European Court of Human Rights over our sovereign decisions. Is he right about that?
He's calling for 2 separate things. He's calling for a Bill of Rights, and the government has committed itself to such legislation in Parliament. We haven't yet seen the bill, but we're promised it in this parliamentary session, and that will affect how the UK courts interpret the Human Rights Convention. But that domestic Bill of Parliament can't affect Britain's obligations under international law. That legislation doesn't pull the UK out of the Council of Europe. That would be a separate political decision. And despite what the Prime Minister said yesterday, his deputy, Dominic Raab, has made it clear on many occasions that the government has no intention of withdrawing from the Council of Europe, of withdrawing from the Human Rights Convention.
Joshua Rosenberg, thank you very much. So listening to what Joshua has just said, Craig, in order to stop in the way that many Conservatives and the government would like to prevent judges in Strasbourg overruling decisions made in domestic courts, the only way would be to actually withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. Is that what you want to see happen?
No, I'm rather more nuanced on it. I mean, I understand exactly where Greg is coming from. In a tweet, you can't always get the full thread of what is being proposed. But, the thought of... It's been through every court of procedure in the UK, including the Supreme Court, and suddenly a judge in Chambers. Up until a couple of months ago, it could have been a Russian judge in Chambers. But
you can't. But you can't stop it.
You can't stop it. Right. But a Bill of Rights might be able to domesticate the final arbiter in some of these situations without withdrawing from the ECHR. I mean, let's look at why the ECHR was put together. It was put together in the remnants of the Second World War, so that new nascent nations could actually have a framework which was internationally agreed. I'm afraid we're seeing an increasing activism by many of these court procedures, and I don't think the British public holds it in high esteem, because this was the body that said we should have votes for prisoners.
But what I'm trying to get to is you can't do anything about it unless you pull out of that convention. You accept that.
I accept that.
And you don't want to do it.
No, I think we'll have to look at the whole procedure as which is the highest court of the land in such circumstances. I would rather it was the appeal court in the UK.
Well, Kirsten, Boris Johnson yesterday seemed to open the door, at least, let's put it that way, to withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights yesterday, saying, will it be necessary to change some laws to help us as we go along? It may very well be, and all these options are under constant review. What was your response to that?
Well, I mean, Boris Johnson says a lot of things, and he often says them for the need in that second to have something to say. So, you know, I'm not sure whether actually that's something that he, in any serious way, thinks that he's going to do going forward. But looking at this general situation, the UK behaviour is wrong here. The UK government is wrong in what it's trying to do. They are absolutely no friend of human rights. Their plan to send people off to Rwanda absolutely demonstrates
because you don't see Rwanda as a safe third country.
I certainly don't. You know, I look at the concerns that LGBT communities, for instance, have raised about people who may be particularly vulnerable. They may already be vulnerable. That's why they've fled somewhere else, and we're shipping them off there in the full knowledge that that increased vulnerability puts them into danger. That's wrong by any standard, and this discussion is a real distraction from the lack of human rights at the focus of what the UK government does.
Is it really worth, Craig, and I will bring you in just a say, is it really worth the government trying again so quickly as they say they're going to do? I think we are expecting a statement from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, when there is judicial review happening over this at the end of July, I think, because I mean, Kirsten is right. It's £120 million to Rwanda. Chartering the flight that never took off was likely to be between £200,000 and £500,000. Is that a good use of public money?
Well, let's get back to what this was meant to be trying to achieve. Well, the French aren't playing ball. They could solve this in a fortnight.
Right, but
so we're having to go for another tool in the box. I accept the Rwanda tool is not the best one, but we've run out of options to actually deter people from making this dangerous crossing, giving millions of pounds to the people traffickers and costing lives. I think it's our duty to do something to try and prevent that flow. We're running out of options, whereas France could solve it with us in a fortnight.
It's a popular policy with many members of the public, isn't it, Gabby?
It is, but it's not, although it's not very popular with the readers of The Guardian on today, but it's not, the trouble is you're not achieving anything by doing this. All you're doing, I mean, Craig has Kent seats, you know, I'm sure you have lots of constituents who feel very strongly about this, but all that's happening if the government keeps going back and trying to sort of get these flights to take off, knowing what's going to happen, you know, knowing that yet again they're going to be challenged in the courts and yet again probably challenged successfully, not actually achieving anything. All you're doing is pointless gesture politics to look like you're doing something while achieving absolutely nothing. And you have to say, I mean, and then threatening to sort of withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights as a result, that's a massive sledgehammer to crack a nut. The court hasn't even said that these flights are unlawful. All it said is wait until the judicial review has taken place, wait until the British courts have decided whether or not this policy is lawful before you start trying to ship people off. And actually, you know, to say as a result of being asked to wait a few weeks, we're going to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights is just ridiculous.
Craig?
Oh, I tend to agree with Gabby's summary there. Actually, I can't see under the current analysis with the, you know, the judge in chambers doing his, you know, what he did yesterday. I can't see the government is going to be able to be any more successful if it tries to do a flight next week. I think, sadly, we do have to wait for that JR at the end of July. Long time away. Flat weather, nice conditions at the moment. We are going to see many, many hundreds more coming over the channel, more millions of pounds to the people traffickers, a trade that's better than drug dealing, and potential deaths. I'm afraid I'm not happy with that. I want action.
How is this?
And so do my public.
How is this working out for the government politically, do you think? Do they look ham-fisted and incompetent? Or is this a fight that they want to have?
I think the Tories clearly think that the Rwanda plan is a vote winner, but I think by the time of the next election, it needs to have actually worked for people to think that the government's done a good job here. And there is a serious problem here. You look at the numbers yesterday, there were 444 people who crossed the channel yesterday, which was the highest number since April. Among them was a heavily pregnant woman, babies, a toddler on someone's shoulders. And I just think if you get into the summer and the numbers are still very high, and God forbid we have an awful tragedy in the Channel, then I think people won't just be blaming judges in Strasbourg or thinking isn't it a shame that the government had been blocked with doing this. I think it will come back to ministers' door, and I think that's why it's so important that they do find a way to actually sort this out and get the numbers to start coming down.
And would Scotland be happy to take the 440 odd people who crossed the Channel then?
Do you know, we have been really open to taking refugees. I think that actually that point about the safety of people is one that's missing in all of this. You know, there are real dangers, of course, for people who are making that perilous journey. So maybe we also need to think, and, you know, we should be thinking about this in the round. It's a serious subject. It shouldn't just be a headline-grabbing kind of issue. You know, what about safe legal routes for people who are in peril? Why is that not something that is further discussed? You know, Scotland is ready to play its part, but the UK government needs to step up here and deal with this as a serious issue, not as something that they're flying headline-grabbing kites on.
Yeah, but do you think it would still break up the business model, as the government describes it, of people traffickers bringing people over?
You know, people traffickers are obviously dealing in a despicable trade. They need to be stopped. I don't think anyone would seriously disagree with that. You know, it's a terrible way to profit on the back of people's misery. But that isn't the whole picture, and that's what we need to be focused on. You know, what about the rights of people in these terribly perilous situations? What about the vulnerabilities of women and children that we've just heard about? What about the LGBT community who are already perhaps persecuted somewhere else, fleeing here and then being sent off? So we really need to have a serious way of looking at this rather than what I think is really just an attempt to grab headlines and a distraction.
Well, I would say we've got a failure of the EU Frontex system. The external border of the EU is not being protected adequately, and we are receiving, you know, the tail end of that as people pass through. Let's not forget here, they're passing through Italy, Germany, Belgium, Holland, France, safe countries where they could be claiming asylum and be looked after decently. And we always come back to this. How many are economic migrants? There always are a lot of very fit young men with money in their pocket, and I don't blame them coming to seek a better economic future in the UK. It actually is a feather in our cap that we're so popular. But that is not what the refugee conventions were all about. This isn't asylum shopping. This is actually managing our borders and our immigration policy in a proper and robust way. All
right, let's take a look at this headline in the Daily Record. Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister, admits Scottish independence will cause challenges at border with England. This follows on from yesterday. Nicola Sturgeon launching her new campaign for Scottish independence. Kirsten, last year she said nobody in the SNP wants to see a border between Scotland and England. What's changed?
I think that what we want to see is the smoothest possible route for goods and services. I don't think that has changed. I don't think that anyone would seriously disagree with that, actually. I think that, again, what everybody does want to see is the best possible future for Scotland. And, you know, my view on that, very much in line with Nicola Sturgeon's, is that our best future is not as part of the Westminster system. It's as part of our own independent country where we can forge a better life for people.
But there is a clear material difference to what she said last year. Nobody in the SNP wants to see a border between Scotland and England. Now she's admitting there is an issue of a possible hard border between the UK and Scotland if it became independent.
She did say that there would be customs and regulatory issues to deal with. And, you know, I think that this is quite interesting, actually, because it's, I think, really demonstrating that difference in focus between how the UK government are approaching things. We talked about Northern Ireland earlier, and the UK government shilly-shallying all over the place. You know, who knows what they're trying to do, who knows what they were trying to say. Nobody understood what that was all about, and that was a deliberate thing on their part. So what Nicola Sturgeon's going to do is to set this all out very clearly, and I welcome that. And she said that yesterday. She will come and speak further. She didn't say that, no. She said that she would speak further about the customs and regulatory environment that would be needed. But she also said, and I think this is important, that we won't shy away from the challenging discussion that needs to happen. And, you know, that's right. You know, this is it's a big change, but I think it's a really important change, and particularly in the context of where we are now, this, you know, Brexit Britain, which Scotland certainly did not vote for. None of the
or is it that the example of what's happened with Northern Ireland and the border down the Irish
Sea made you think a little bit more?
Well, and you're going to do it completely differently. You're nodding away.
Well, I'm sure that we can take some lessons from that.
Example that's actually put a bit of reality reality on the table. I mean, the whole issue of Scottish independence. I mean, reports, not my reports, but reports that have been written. You'd have 180 billion of debt inherited. You'll have 20 billion of an annual debt every year. You would not be allowed to join the EU with those levels of economic failure. And we've seen what the EU is like on borders, external borders, of which you'd like Scotland to be the external border of the EU with the rest of the UK in the future. It doesn't work. They don't want it to work. They're vindictive on these things. They're not prepared to negotiate. And, you know, I find it phenomenal. You have huge representation in Westminster. You have a very powerful voice. You're part of everything. You have a lot of devolution and powers that you're not even using, many of them, but you seem to want to transfer that into a little bit of representation in the EU. It's just phenomenal.
What have you got to say to Greg?
Well, you know, it sounds a little bit as if, you know, Craig thinks we should be grateful for what Westminster gives us, and that's not how it should work. How really any democracy should work is that the people who live in a country should be able to determine their own future. That's not, I don't think, a great deal to ask. And the thing that Craig, I think, is forgetting, and amongst all his, you know, quite surprising hyperbole, which doesn't really bear any scrutiny, yes, it is that we have a mandate here. And that's really important. So it's not OK for the Westminster government to deny democracy in Scotland. There's a really clear mandate that the SNP has over a number of elections. The Scottish Parliament has an indisputable mandate. People voted for this. People expect us to fulfil our manifesto. If I can continue, well, I'm sure you're aware of how a proportional system works, but we have a very clear mandate for this. People should and do expect us to fulfil that mandate. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Scotland can have so much better than it does under the Westminster system. And the comparisons that we saw yesterday are just the start of us drawing that out for people.
I mean, it is clear. The mandate is clear, Craig. You can't get away from it because the SNP have never shied away from saying their goal is an independent Scotland. And they win election after election. So do you agree it is wearing a bit thin,
well,
the argument
the big election
the government?
Has to be the nationwide referendum. And that was 55-45 saying no thanks.
Democracy did not stop in 2014.
By all means, revisit it in a generation. That's been discussed many times. But 8 years on, it seems you don't really like referendum results, and the EU one is another case in point.
Can I bring you two in on how the border, in your mind, would work? Looking to some extent at what's happening in Northern Ireland, it's interesting that Nicola Sturgeon is starting to look at this issue seriously. Gabby?
Yeah, I just wonder if it's the beginning of perhaps confronting a whole series of awkward questions that were a bit brushed over in 2014, you know, and then the SNP line was very much, well, it's fine, stop making a fuss about this, it's all going to be fine. And, you know, there were questions about monetary union, there were questions about its joining the EU or not, all sorts of questions. And it does look to me as if Nicola Sturgeon has looked at what's happened in Northern Ireland and said, the trouble is you pay further down the line for not being upfront about this stuff to start with. So let's have a more honest conversation about what independence means. And I think that's the right strategy, but then it does, you know, you do get bogged down very quickly in some very complicated and awkward questions for the independence lobby. But I think that's the way it's got to be. You know, you've got to be honest from the start about what it really involves and what the real pros and cons are. It's really interesting that they've chosen to have this discussion now and to set the sort of deadline of another referendum by October 2023. I just wonder how they're seeing that fitting in with the British electoral cycle.
Right, I mean, because Scotland does more trade with the UK than with the EU, I mean, won't a hard border create extra costs for Scottish businesses, which will probably reduce trade? I mean, it is going to take some time anyway for you to rejoin the EU. What will happen in between?
Yeah, and we absolutely do want to rejoin the EU, and you know the trade with the EU is really important.
So there'll be an economic cost, won't there? There'll be a reduction in trade.
As I was saying, as is the trade with the rest of the UK, and so that's why we want to have that serious conversation. And Gabby's right, you know, it's important to have a serious conversation about these things, about the customs and the regulatory issues, but also about so many other issues too. Because fundamentally, what sits at the heart of all of this is the point that Scotland is not best served under the current system. Scotland can do better. All of these other independent countries that we looked at yesterday are a really clear demonstration of this. So the system as it stands is not working for us. People have a right to choose what their future will be. And, it's time that they had that opportunity.
That document yesterday with the comparisons, though, it was completely like pick and choose, cherry picking over which countries you compared the UK with. So you didn't have countries like Portugal in there. You did have other countries where you knew that the comparisons on particular things, such as GDP per head, would be advantageous. But there was no suggestion in there. If suddenly Scotland becomes independent, why would those figures change for Scotland? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Because
it's just fanciful.
At the moment, have not got the levers that an independent country has. And, that's what sits at the heart of all of this. The system at the moment means that we have governments that we don't vote for. Scotland hasn't voted for a Conservative government since 1955. And yet here we are. This Conservative government is riding roughshod over the will of Scotland, whether it's on Brexit or other things.
That document wasn't examining what changes could actually happen to Scotland. It was presenting some random figures and trying to make a case with them.
I'm sorry, they're not random figures. They're reasonably sensible comparators. I think, yes, you could choose a number of comparators. These are pretty sensible comparators, countries that are in the general neighbourhood that we sit in geographically. I think that this sort of focus on the fact that they do things better, that they can do things better, and that we don't have the ability to make these changes ourselves because we don't have the levers. I think that that's an important point, and I think that notion that we can actually work for a fairer, wealthier, more equal Scotland is a very attractive one to people.
They were dodgy graphs, and voters will see through them, and that's why independence is falling back in the polls again.
I don't think so. No.
I mean, in terms of support for independence, Nicola Sturgeon did say at one point, not only would it be a once in a generation, and I know we've had many conversations about it, but there would have to be consistent majority support in the polls. Are you closer to that?
Do you know what? I think that considering that the campaign is, I suppose, only kicking off as of yesterday, I think that we're in a very healthy position in terms of polling.
But you're not there.
Where we were when the independence campaign started, in relation to the 2014 referendum. So, I think it is a conversation that people want to have. I think if you're looking at, at polls, at voter outcomes, then look at these elections where we have been mandated to do this. This is what we have a mandate to do.
Okay.
People want us to fulfil the promise that we made to hold a referendum. Well, I think that people will choose Scotland having a better future as an independent country.
I would say when the Scottish people really start looking at the ferry contracts that the government in the SNP government's managed to achieve, they'll probably look in horror about how they might run an entire economy, but we'll leave that there.
All right, let's move on and talk about the strikes that are coming down the track, to coin a phrase, next week. The government has called a 3-hour debate in the Commons this afternoon on those forthcoming rail strikes. 3 days of strikes are planned for next week. It will disrupt much of the rail network in England in the biggest walkout on the railways since 1989. In Scotland, rail unions are likely to agree to a 5% pay deal following several months of disruption on the recent nationalised ScotRail network. So will the government in Westminster follow Scotland's lead or resist inflationary pay demands? Here's the headline in the Evening Standard: 6,000 more national rail staff to be balloted over strike action. The situation is getting worse. Another union now, as we can see there, the Transport Salaried Staffs Association, balloting its staff on strike action next month. This is on top, of course, of the action that we're already talking about. Is it time for the government to find a resolution and get round the table with the unions?
What we're seeing now is the unions using their power, and over national rail is certainly a powerful tool. I would have hoped this country is in some distress with cost of living crises, and we're not pulling together. And I think the public will see this type of activity and say, we're all suffering here. We've got a national situation that needs solving. And here you are wanting an inflation-busting pay rise. Already quite well-paid staff, let's not forget, they're quite well-paid. And I think it will be taken very, very badly. This will hit national production over those few days.
Yeah.
This is very negative.
So you're going to take them on. You want the government to take them on in the way it looks as if it's going to unfold.
France, you'd think, is probably more unionised than the UK, and more of that flavour. They have got a national minimum guarantee of service, so the strikes are not able to, diminish service beyond a sort of 2/3 level. I don't want that to happen. I think unions have got a very powerful and useful role to play, but this puts them in a very bad light. They will not be respected by the British public.
Hasn't the Scottish Government just caved in to wage demands?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you said yourself there's been a lengthy period of discussion and negotiation.
You've caved in.
I don't think that's how negotiation works. You know, I think that it should be a two-way process. It has been a two-way process. These things are not necessarily easy. They're not necessarily straightforward, but, you know, it has come to a conclusion. And, you know, I welcome the fact that ASLEF are recommending to their members that they do accept. And, you know, I would like to see a positive route forward. But obviously it's going to be a challenging situation for passengers if the strikes go ahead. I think that the way that the UK government are approaching this combative way is not going to resolve that.
Well,
they need to get round the table and talk.
It's taken months, though, for the Scottish Government to get to a resolution. Nicola Sturgeon could have done this earlier. Who else is the Scottish Government going to give a 5% pay rise to?
Well, you know, there are discussions going on all the time about the different pay settlements that people want to see. They will all be subject to negotiation. That's the way that should work, and that's the way that it does work. But I don't think that the UK government having a pop at people who are members of trade unions and having a pop at people collectively bargaining is a sensible way forward, because for all the challenges that people will face, I think that it's reasonable that they do make their voices heard.
John?
I think this is a really tricky one for the Labour Party, and you look at how the Tory government are trying to get some advantage from this. You look at that emergency debate this afternoon. I mean, it's basically opposition.
What's that going to achieve?
Well, it's going to achieve nothing.
It's very rare.
It's going to achieve nothing. It's clearly it's a stunt, but it is opposition party tactics being used by the government, because they're going to hold this vote, condemn the strikes, and make it very difficult for the Labour Party.
It's difficult for Labour now for precisely that reason, you know, and you can already see differences appearing on the front bench. You know, we thought Labour was supposed to be against strikes under Keir Starmer, but anyone with ambitions, shall we say, within the shadow cabinet suddenly feels they couldn't possibly condemn a rail strike. But I think in a few ways we're going to see, if I was the government, I wouldn't get too cocky about that, because I think we're heading into a very difficult few months in terms of public sector pay negotiations. You know, lots of deserving public sector workers who are going to be saying, look, we haven't had a pay rise in God knows how long, and there's the inflation's running at 10%. We have to have a more generous deal. It's going to be very, very difficult for the Chancellor to say no at that point, particularly to professions that have been on the front line throughout the pandemic, to whom we're all very grateful, you know, and who've had a really rough kind of decade, pretty much, in terms of pay rises. So it's going to be very, very hard to keep a ceiling on those. I think what we're seeing now with the rail strikes is probably only the tip of the iceberg.
Craig?
Yeah, well, I'm worried about a wage price spiral. Once you start getting into that, you know, I get 10% pay rise, everything else will go up 11%, so next year you want 11%, and that was the 1970s, and that was a disastrous spiral. And it is strange. I'm glad you mentioned the Labour Party. I mean, they don't seem to have a position on...
Well, they're not here, but...
They haven't got a position on Rwanda. I don't know what they want. They haven't got a position
I'll be
on
asking them after
these
Prime Minister's
issues,
questions.
And they will not say that this strike is wrong for the national, UK PLC. They will not say it.
Kirsten?
Well, do you know, I mean, I think it's interesting, Craig's approach to this. You know, he's having a go at opposition politicians, he's having a go at the unions, he's having a go at the people who work in these industries. But he's not really accepting the fact that his government is deliberately trying to pick a fight there, rather than making efforts, however challenging, and, you know, nobody suggests it isn't challenging, to actually enter into discussions. This is a difficult time in all kinds of ways for people. So it's a time for mature conversations and proper discussions, no matter how difficult they may be. But again, I think that the Tory government are posturing and headline grabbing on this rather than trying to do the serious work.
Because you do understand the danger of a wage price spiral.
I understand perfectly, but I also understand that the only way to get to a sensible position is by dialogue and conversation, and that's something that your government seemed to be a bit of a stranger to.
I mean, you're going to have to explain to constituents why there's going to be possibly a summer of disruption, a summer of strikes across all sorts of industries, aren't you?
Yeah, well, these are the unions will have to say why they're doing it. I know blame always falls on the government no matter whatever goes wrong.
Well,
but
they are the ones
I think people
in
on
charge,
this one
supposedly.
will see very clearly that they are quite well-paid people, and they needn't do this. Negotiations could continue, and they're going to be putting a vast amount of this country out of work for a few days. It's not on, and it must be stopped.
We have Prime Minister's questions in just under 10 minutes' time. Let's just go into the chamber. You can see it is starting to fill up. We will return there, of course, as soon as PMQs starts. And as I say, we have this expected statement afterwards from Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, following what happened to that flight that was set to take off to Rwanda. Can I just turn to another story? The independent expert panel, Kirsten, which recommends punishments for MPs over bullying, harassment or sexual misconduct, has recommended that the SNP's Patrick Grady be suspended from Parliament for 2 days. He was found to have made an unwanted sexual advance towards a junior male member of staff who was 19 at the time, including the MP touching and stroking his neck, hair and back. Just before I get a comment from you, here's Patrick Grady apologising in the Commons yesterday.
Mr. Speaker, I am profoundly sorry for my behaviour and I deeply regret my actions and their consequences. Mr. Speaker, I give you and this House my firm assurance that I have learned significant lessons through this process and a firm undertaking that such behaviour on my part will never happen again.
Patrick Grady yesterday in the Commons. Kirsten, he's been suspended from the Commons for 2 days, next Monday and Tuesday. How long will he be suspended from the party?
He's suspended from our whip for a period of time until that suspension, which you've just referred to, is over. And, you know, I'm glad that you played some of what was said there, because I think it was very important that we heard that, because obviously it's a very serious situation. The ICGS have dealt with it in that way, and, you know, we've awaited what they had to say, as, you know, as we ought to and as we should, and take their recommendations entirely on board, as I note Mr Grady did yesterday.
It was a significant breach.
You know, everything that they have recommended, I think we should and we must accept.
It's really shameful how the SNP have dealt with this. And Kirsten, if this was another party, you would rightly be cross about it and be criticising it. When the allegations first were made aware to Ian Blackford, who is your leader in Westminster, in 2018, he brought the victim and Mr Grady into a room together and made him say sorry for it. And the victim now says he felt pressured into accepting that apology. And then, rather than thinking maybe this guy isn't the best guy to be our chief whip in charge of party discipline, he kept him in that role as the SNP's chief whip in Westminster for 3 more years until this complaint came before the Commons authorities. I think that is just so weak. The thing that's been put first in all of this is Patrick Grady rather than the victim.
Kirsten?
I think actually that what we've done is to let the process play out, and I think that that's been really important. It's a completely
hang on.
It's but that's not my choice, and that, you know, that's a choice that is made by the independent people who have got the job of looking at this. They've obviously looked at it in detail correctly. It's not something that other MPs determine, and nor should they. You know, it should be an independent process. I think that there's nobody who should take away from the seriousness of this. So, you know, please be assured that I don't and would not do that. I'm not going to talk about individual staff members, because I don't think that that's fair at all. But the seriousness of this absolutely doesn't escape me, and that's why we have absolutely accepted all of the recommendations which have been put forward by the ICGS and the independent panel.
It's still 2 days. Do you think the party could have made a stronger stand here? You could have done something beyond that, couldn't you?
You know, there's all kinds of things I think that are possible. You know, I think that none of this is going to be ideal because of the, you know, as you've said, the very serious situation that we're facing. So, the ICGS process, I think, is the key one here. You know, we need to allow them to do what all parties have agreed that they will do. That has now taken place. They have made their recommendations, and we absolutely accept them.
Prime Minister's question starting in a few minutes' time. Gabby, what will Keir Starmer, do you think, be questioning Boris Johnson about? Because he was criticised quite extensively, although backed up, actually, by Bridget Phillipson, who was sitting next to me after Prime Minister's questions last week, saying it was the right strategy to pursue issues around the National Health Service rather than trying to exploit and press the bruise of Boris Johnson's discomfort over that confidence vote.
Bit of an awkward week for him, because I think, you know, he could go back in that sort of direction of Boris Johnson's integrity and honesty and pick up on what Lord Geidt was saying yesterday about him potentially breaching the ministerial code. But, you know, there is an element of his party that thinks stop going on about Partygate, you know, talk about real lives. I really doubt he's going to want to talk about rail strikes or the Rwanda flights or anything where the Labour Party is in a difficult position. I'm sure the government would love him to talk about anything that would allow them to portray him as a lefty lawyer. So a cost of living crisis is probably a banker.
Right. I mean, that probably is the most sensible thing to take Boris Johnson to task over.
I think definitely. I think the problem, though, isn't the choice of topic, and I can see why last week he chose that topic rather than going on with Partygate again. But I think the delivery needs to be improved. Every week he seems so reliant on the sheets of paper, turning between the sheets of paper. And I think that is the complaint you get here from a lot of people on the Labour backbenches, is they want more passion, they want him speaking more off the cuff. They don't want him just stood there reading out from a script.
Gabby?
I think those criticisms are all pretty fair, to be honest, and I think that's what you hear a lot, that he needs to somehow discover some passion, or he needs to discover some genuine, what feels like genuine anger. I'm not saying he's not genuinely angry about Partygate, I'm sure he is, but it doesn't kind of come across in the way that you want to. Doesn't connect. You don't have those electrifying moments where Tory MPs look at their shoes and feel embarrassed, and Labour MPs feel, well, hey, you know, we're on a roll here. We haven't had a PMQs like that for a while. And some people would say, you know, what does PMQs matter in the end? You know, even though we're all convened in a studio to discuss it. But, you know, it's a bigger problem as well, I think, about not being able to sort of connect fiscally with people.
I mean, it's interesting because, yes, Angela Rayner, the party's deputy leader, was on Newscast and we spoke to her. And there is a division. Obviously, they're complementing each other, as she would say. And she did use that phrase. Keir Starmer perhaps does need to put a bit more welly into it. But he's a great antidote to Boris Johnson because he's detailed. Yes, he is a lawyer. He's more forensic. Does that not play better with the public after what we've had with Boris Johnson?
I think it did for a long period, and that's why you see Labour, you know, taking the poll lead. It did because whatever other, you know, limitations you might think he has, people thought he was honest, people thought he was straight, people thought he was, you know, calm and considered and would sort of get on with the job and without all this sort of wild diversions in his private life. But that only gets you so far, and I think since also, you know, the sort of whole Durham police investigation into Starmer as well, that's become a slightly more awkward, you know, thing to get across. So you need more than that. You need more than I'm a nice guy.
Right. I mean, on cost of living, that's just going to continue, isn't it? We've already talked about inflation going beyond 10%. We've had the Office of National Statistics saying wages are going to be squeezed even further. It's only going to get more and more difficult and worse for Boris Johnson and the government.
It's going to be a tough year, there's no doubt about that, no doubt at all. I always try and play Sir Keir bingo at this time of day and wonder where he's going to go. He's got nothing to say on immigration, border controls.
Well, let's concentrate on what Boris Johnson's got to say about cost of living.
Well, cost of living, we've given out 37 billion of various support thus far. I think we're going to see quite a lively tax, in my view, a tax-cutting budget in the autumn. We need some support now, but I think we're going to wait for the autumn to see where the public finances are. They're in better shape. We've got good tax receipts. We've got windfall taxes coming here and there and everywhere.
All right, well, maybe you're stealing his lines. Here he is.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
My word. Government support for households is greatly appreciated, but high energy costs are also causing massive problems for businesses and particularly energy-intense manufacturing. Will the Prime Minister support the Repowering the Black Country initiative, backed by the LEP and by Andy Street, to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, and will he meet with me to look at how the Black Country can be a pilot project to decarbonise, reduce costs and protect the region's manufacturing jobs?
Well, I thank my honourable friend that he's a great champion for Dudley and for the Black Country, and in addition to the £1,200 for the 8 million most vulnerable households that we're providing, £400 to help everybody with the cost of energy, Mr. Speaker. We're supporting the Black Country with cost-efficient energy infrastructure, and the region has already received £1.5 million to develop a cluster plan for decarbonisation.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pay tribute to all those who served in the Falklands? My uncle was among them, serving on the HMS Antelope when it went down. Thankfully, he made it back, but too many serving in that war didn't, and we remember them all. Mr. Speaker, Britain is set for lower growth than every major economy except Russia. Why?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, I'll tell him. Mr. Speaker, actually, we are going to have, according to the IMF and the OECD, we are, in addition to the fastest growth in the G7 last year, we're going to have the second fastest this year, and we will return to the top of the table, Mr. Speaker. But the reason, Mr. Speaker, other countries are temporarily moving ahead is, of course, because we came out of the pandemic faster than they did, because we took the right decisions to come out of lockdown, which he opposed, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, right now, Mr. Speaker, we have the highest number of people on payroll employment on record, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, he always likes to blame global forces, but global forces are just that, global. Everybody faces them. Britain isn't under crippling economic sanctions like Russia. No wonder he doesn't want to answer the question, why is the UK set for lower growth than every other major economy?
Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, I think everybody can see that I've just answered the question. Once again, he's guilty of what my legal friends call ignoratio elenchi. He's failed to listen to what I've actually said, Mr. Speaker. What would be useful in supporting the UK economy right now would be if the leader of the Labour Party ended his sphinx-like silence about the RMT strikes coming up in the course of the next couple of weeks. Will he now break with his shadow Transport Secretary and denounce Labour's rail strikes?
He's in government.
Just to remind the Prime Minister, he seems to have gone. It's Prime Minister's question, it's not opposition question. Keir Starmer.
He's in government. He could do something to stop the strikes, but he hasn't lifted a finger. I don't want the strikes to go ahead, but he does. He wants, Mr. Speaker, he wants the country to grind to a halt so he can feed off the division. And as for, Mr. Speaker, as for his boasting about the economy, he thinks he can perform Jedi mind tricks on the country. These aren't the droids you're looking for. No rules were broken. The economy is booming. The problem is, the Force just isn't with him anymore. He thinks he's Obi-Wan Kenobi. The truth is, he's Jabba the Hutt. Last week, he stood there and boasted that we would continue to grow the economy. This week, it turns out, the economy shrank for the second month in a row. How does it help Britain to have an ostrich Prime Minister with his head in the sand?
Prime Minister. There he goes again, Mr. Speaker, running this country down when everybody we've got the highest payroll employment.
Look, I want to hear the questions and the answers, and whether you like it, but I genuinely believe it, the public who watch it also want to hear both. Prime Minister.
I mean, Mr. Speaker, we've got lower unemployment than France, Germany, Italy, Canada. We've got the highest number of people in payroll jobs, as I've just said, 620,000 more since records began. And he might like to know this, that just in the first 5 months of this year, this country has attracted, I think, £16 billion of investment in its tech sector. He doesn't like these European comparisons. Let's make it for him. 3 times as much as Germany, twice as much as France, Mr. Speaker. He should be talking this country up, not running it down.
That's the ostrich. He's not just denying how bad things are, he's actively making things worse. His 15 tax rises are throttling growth, and the director of the CBI is so fed up, he's reduced to saying, can we stop Operation Save Big Dog and move to action stations on the economy? Now, Mr. Speaker, we know what the Prime Minister says about British business in private. I think that's pretty unparliamentary. But when did screwing business turn from a flippant comment into economic policy?
Mr. Speaker, look, I just reminded the House of what's happening in Tech Week in this country, the massive investment that's coming in, helped, by the way, by this 130% super deduction for business investment that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has put in. Never forget, Mr. Speaker, that Labour, under Labour, taxes go up on businesses and on people. We're not only putting £1,200 more into people's pockets, we're having a tax cut worth £330. He talks about taxes, £330 on average for everybody who pays national insurance. Labour have already made spending commitments in this Parliament alone worth £94 billion more than the government is spending. That's £2,100 for every household in the country, Mr. Speaker. No wonder no Labour government has ever left office with unemployment lower than when they came in.
Mr. Speaker, 15 tax rises, and we're sacked for the highest tax burden since rationing. He says the economy is booming when it's shrinking. He's game playing so much. He thinks he's on Love Island. Trouble is, Prime Minister, I'm reliably informed that contestants that give the public the ick get booted out. And it's not just low growth. He's also lost control of inflation. He was warned about this last September. And what did he do? He dismissed it. He didn't act. He sat on his hands. Now prices are through the roof, and we're set to have the highest inflation in the G7. When will he accept he got it badly wrong when he claimed that worries about inflation were unfounded?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're helping people with the cost of living with £1,200. On the 14th of July, the money will be going into people's bank accounts. Why can we do that, Mr. Speaker? Because we have the fiscal firepower to do it, because the economy is in robust shape, with record numbers of people in payroll employment, Mr. Speaker. And that is thanks to the steps that we took that he continuously opposed. And if he wants to, and I just remind Mr. Speaker, he has a chance. I won't say this interrogatively, Mr. He has the chance now to clear it up. He can oppose the Labour's rail strikes right now. Say he can disagree. He can disagree, and give him that opportunity. Let him disagree with the union barons who would add to people's costs in the coming weeks.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want the strikes to go ahead. He does so he can feed on the division. Mr. Speaker, they're making a lot of noise now, but I've got a long list here of what his MPs really think of him. Yeah. Dragging everyone down. Who said that? Yeah. Come on. Who was it said that? Authority is destroyed. Come on, hands up. Which of you was it? Which of you? Come on. Can't win back trust. Anybody owning up? You're very quiet now. Hands. Mr. Speaker, my personal favourite is this. This is a document circulated by his backbench, in which they call him the Conservative Corbyn. Exactly. Prime Minister, I don't think that was intended as a compliment. Week after week, he stands there and spouts the same nonsense. The economy's booming. Everything's going swimmingly. The people should be grateful. But whilst he's telling Britain that we never had it so good, millions of working people and businesses know the reality. Britain's growth is going to be slower than our competitors and our inflation higher. A Prime Minister who sounds totally deluded, totally failing on the economy, failing to tackle...
I think we need to get to the end of the question, but I'll just remind you, I will hear the end of the question in silence. Any more noise in this corner, there'll be another cup of tea early if we're not careful. Yes,
a Prime Minister who sounds totally deluded, totally failing the economy, failing to tackle inflation, failing to back business, failing to help working people through the crisis. And, Mr. Speaker, His big idea, go back to imperial measurements. He's got 80s inflation, 70s stagnation, now he wants 60s wage to complete the set. When is he going to ditch the gimmicks and face up to reality that under him Britain's economy is going backwards?
Let's see the Prime Minister. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a couple of quick points about Mr. Corbyn, the Right Honourable Member for Islington North. First of all, he tried repeatedly to get him elected as Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker. Secondly, speaking from experience, he's relatively dynamic by comparison with the Right Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Speaker. Dynamic and coherent.
Might be helpful if you speak to me. I'm struggling to hear because of the noise on both sides. So please, if you look to the chair, it'll be easier for both of us.
But what we're going to get on and do, Mr. Speaker, is continue to take the tough decisions to take this country forward, and decisions that are on the side of the British people, Mr. Speaker. They're blatantly on the side of the RMT union barons. When there are some ticket offices that barely sell one ticket per hour, Mr. Speaker, we are on the side of the travelling public. By the way, he hasn't mentioned this, but they're on the side of the people traffickers who would risk people's lives at sea, Mr. Speaker. And we are on the side of people who come here safely and legally. Safely and legally, Mr. Speaker. They carp and snipe from the sidelines. That's what they've always done. We take the big decisions to take this country forward. And no matter how much welly his right honourable friend, the deputy leader, may ask him to apply, it doesn't matter how much welly he pretends to apply, when that welly, Mr. Speaker, is always on the left foot.
Many areas like mine have already had massive new housing development with no commensurate increase in general practice.
Sorry. Point of order. The Honourable Lady's been here for so long, she should also know that points of order can only come at the end. Sandra Sullivan.
Oh dear.
Many areas.
Have a conversation later, but certainly it's not. Andrew Sullivan.
Many areas like mine have already had massive new housing development with no commensurate increase in general practice capacity. In one of my surgeries, with double the recommended number of patients per GP, a bowel cancer diagnosis of a 51-year-old father of 4 was missed and is now terminal. Getting this right is a life and death issue. So will the Prime Minister make sure that parts of the country that have already had massive new housing growth get the commensurate increase in general practice capacity that is only right and fair?
Prime Minister. Yes, Mr. Speaker, and of course we've increased the numbers of doctors by 6,000, up to 1,200 more GPs since this time last year, 11,800 more nurses, but we must make sure that areas, particularly where areas of new sensitive development is going in, that there are the infrastructure services, particularly medical services, that they need. The NHS has a statutory duty to take account of population growth. I know he's met my honourable friend, the Health Secretary. I will take it up personally to make sure we get a proper approach to, I think, a very, very important issue.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I join you and others that are remembering today the Falklands conflict of 40 years ago, and those like my colleague Keith Brown, the Scottish Justice Minister, that served there, and in particular our thoughts are with those that paid the ultimate sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, yesterday our First Minister started a national conversation on Scotland's right to choose an independent future. When we look at nations like Iceland, Ireland, Norway and Denmark, it is clear that our neighbours are outperforming the United Kingdom. They deliver greater income equality, lower poverty rates, higher productivity, social mobility and business investment. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on and on. The evidence is overwhelming. Scotland is being held back by Westminster. Prime Minister, all those countries can use the powers of independence to create wealthier, fairer and greener societies. Why not Scotland?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't doubt my right honourable friend's talents as a conversationalist, but I think there are other subjects in the national conversation right now, and they include, Mr. Speaker, what we're doing to come through the aftershocks of COVID with the strongest jobs-led recovery of any European economy. As I said, 620,000 more people across the whole of the UK, Mr. Speaker, in payroll employment than there were before the pandemic began. And I think another subject of national conversation is investment into our whole country, investment in Scotland, investment across the whole of the UK, as I mentioned already, in the tech centre. And the whole of the UK standing strong together on the international stage and sticking up for the Ukrainians. I think that's some of the things that the country is also talking about, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Yes, stronger together. Has the Prime Minister seen the pound? I think the financial markets are giving their judgment on this Prime Minister. You know, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister can afford to live in his own little world, his own little Britain. But people have to live with the reality of a failing Westminster system. A cost of living crisis worse in the UK than any other G7 country. An inflation rate double that of France. The second worst economic growth forecast in the G20, next to only sanctioned Russia. And now, a threat of a trade war with our European friends, triggered by a law-breaking Prime Minister. That is not a vision for the future of Scotland. Our nation is big enough, rich enough and smart enough. Isn't it the case, Prime Minister, that Scotland simply can't afford to remain trapped in the failing Westminster system? Mr. Speaker, stop the world. Scotland wants to get on.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the figures speak for themselves. The UK has record numbers of people in payroll employment. That's an astounding thing when you consider where we were during the pandemic. That was because of the UK working well together, as he will remember, with the vaccine rollout, with the testing, which Scotland and the rest of the country cooperated brilliantly. And, Mr. Speaker, he talks about a trade war. He talks about a trade war. What could be more foolish, Mr. Speaker, than a project that actually envisages trade barriers within parts of the United Kingdom? That's what we're trying to break down.
Craig Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the Jubilee celebrations, I was honoured to share part of them with Cohort 4, an inspirational mentoring and support group who provide life-changing support to a wide range of women, such as those who've tragically been the victim of domestic violence, sexual abuse or suffer from mental health difficulties. Sadly, as a result of the pandemic, the need for these services has only grown. So would the Prime Minister join me in thanking Beverly and her team for the incredible work that they do at Cohort 4 and set out what more government can do to support these organisations so they can continue to deliver the vital care to vulnerable men and women across all of our constituencies?
I thank my honourable friend. I want to extend my thanks also to Beverly and everybody in Cohort 4 for what they're doing. The extra support that we're giving includes £140 million of funding for victims' services and £47 million ring-fence, particularly for organisations such as Cohort 4. Thank you to Cohort 4 and similar organisations for everything that they do.
David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in paying tribute to our armed forces and sending our thanks and gratitude to the veterans of the Falklands War and their families? Mr. Speaker, millions of families across our country are suffering because of the cost of living emergency. And people in rural areas are especially hurting, bearing the brunt of record fuel price rises. The Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme is supposed to help by taking money off the price of petrol. But some rural counties aren't eligible, like Cumbria, like Shropshire and like Devon. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative parties want to hear ideas to help those people, and I think the people of Devon will note. Because there are families and pensioners across rural counties who are missing out on this support. So, Mr. Speaker, as petrol prices soar, will the Prime Minister accept our idea to help people in rural counties and expand rural fuel duty relief?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we cut fuel duty for everybody across the country by record sums. He talks about pensioners, Mr. Speaker. We're giving £850 more to every pensioner across the country. And he talks about the cost of energy. Everybody is going to get another £400 to help them with the costs of energy. And the blissful fact about the Liberal Democrats, Mr. Speaker, is people don't actually know what their policies are. And they're able to go around the country. They're able to go around the country bamboozling the rural communities, not revealing that they're in fact in favour of massive new green taxes, Mr. Speaker, which is what they want, and not revealing that they would like to go back straight away into the common agricultural policy with all the bureaucracy and all the costs that entails. They don't say that on the doorstep, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are proposals for up to 10,000 housing units on flood-prone greenfield sites to the west of Ifield in my constituency that would also represent intolerable pressure on local services. Can I have an assurance from the Prime Minister that as we update planning legislation, we will enshrine the brownfield principle first for new developments and save our environment and our services?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right, and we encourage the use of suitable brownfield land, and our policy is for brownfield first, everywhere and always.
Neil Hanby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Prime Minister will know from my recent correspondence that my Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath constituent, Ruth Zuccarello, is the sister of Jim Fitton, who is currently imprisoned in Iraq and sentenced to 15 years for collecting some shards of pottery. The judge passing sentence did not believe that Mr. Fitton had any criminal intent. And this has obvious and significant implications for Jim and his loved ones. So I would ask the Prime Minister if he would be willing to meet with me and other MPs who have constituents in Jim's family to discuss this case so that we can work in concert to resolve some of those issues.
Well, I'm really grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising Mr. Fitton's case, and I have a great deal of sympathy, I must say, with him. I'll make sure that he gets the right honourable gentleman gets a meeting with the relevant minister as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my youngest constituents, little Nellie Oakshott, is 2 years old and has been diagnosed with metachromatic leukodystrophy. Her very brave parents, Megan and Tom, are supporting a campaign to see MLD added to the newborn blood spot test. Had that been included in the test, Nellie's condition could be treated. Now, the family are squaring up to palliative care and planning to make every day count. Will the Prime Minister give his support to add MLD to this heel prick test so that families in the future can be spared this same heartbreak?
I thank her very much, and I know that the thoughts of everybody will be with Nellie and her parents, Tom and Megan, in a very, very difficult time. And what I can tell her is that the National Screening Committee has received a request to look again at the conditions for doing an MLD test, and that is currently being reviewed right now. But I will make sure that she gets a meeting as soon as possible with the relevant minister.
Liz Twist.
Mr. Speaker, in just 5 days, rail passengers across the UK and in the North East will be facing huge disruption. Do you want to listen? No, we don't. But on the eve of the biggest rail dispute in a generation, it's emerged that ministers have not held any talks whatsoever since March. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Prime Minister.
You've done out.
I ask the Prime Minister, has he met with trade unions and employers in the rail industry to attempt to bring this dispute to an end? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, I noticed that what one union baron was asked about this. He said, "I don't negotiate with a Tory government," is what he said. That's what they said, Mr. Speaker. We all know how much money the Labour front bench take from the RMT, Mr. Speaker. We know why they're sitting on their hands during Labour's rail strikes. They should come out and condemn it, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Pension Credit Awareness Day. Pension credit is currently underclaimed. Around a quarter of those entitled don't claim it. So all my right honourable friend join me in encouraging people in Godling and throughout the country to check their eligibility, make that claim so we can get more money into the pockets of pensioners.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's a very, very worthwhile and important campaign that my honourable friend supports. Too many pensioners fail to take up their entitlements under pension credit. It can be worth another £3,300 a year, and the more we can do to make pensioners aware of it, the better.
Anna Mackmore.
Thank you. Why is it that the worst people often rise to the highest office and stay there? Not my words about the Prime Minister, but those of his newest appointment, his cost of living czar. Families across Cardiff North, crippled with skyrocketing bills, unable to afford even the most basic necessities, all agree with him, saying this Prime Minister has to go. So if his own czar doesn't even have faith in him, tell me why those struggling should.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she's asked that question repeatedly, but let me just remind her that this is a government that gets on and delivers on our promises to the people, and in particular getting Brexit done. I read the other day, Mr. Speaker, that she wants to go back into the single market and into the customs union. I think if that's the real policy of the Labour Party, Mr. Speaker, going back into the EU, then why won't the leader of the opposition admit it?
But Timpson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When our family adopted my two brothers in the 1980s, support for adopters, whether that be financial, therapeutic or professional, was minimal. And by the time I became a family law barrister in the late 1990s, it really wasn't much better. Efforts since, particularly the Adoption Support Fund from 2015 onwards, has improved the situation, but as ever, there's much more that we can do. And to that end, would my right honourable friend look at making self-employed adopters eligible for statutory adoption pay so they can also have a better and fairer start to family life?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend, and he's a great champion for adopters and all those who help give children a loving and stable home. We've so far focused on supporting, he's quite right, we're focused on supporting employed parents, but local authorities do have the power to provide discretionary payments equivalent to maternity allowance for self-employed adopters as well.
Gary McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that at times of economic hardship, suicide rates are likely to rise too. We saw that after the 2008 crash. So as well as doing more to support people through the cost of living crisis, will the Prime Minister commit to doing more to support excellent suicide prevention campaigns like CALM, the campaign against living miserably, and also implement Labour's pledge that anyone in need of it should be able to access mental health counselling within a month, an end to waiting lists?
Prime Minister.
She's entirely right, Mr. Speaker, and we must focus ever more on mental health. That's why we're putting another £2.3 billion into supporting mental health services, including suicide prevention and the many wonderful charities that help people with their conditions, Mr. Speaker. And you know, all I can say is it would be a good thing if across the floor of this House we had support for the spending that we're putting in.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The conflict in Ukraine and the consequent disruption of the supply chain in wheat has highlighted the need for the United Kingdom to become more self-sufficient in food. The Genetic Technology Bill, which has its second reading this afternoon, will help create the conditions to enable English farmers to produce more food of higher quality. But does my right honourable friend agree that the drive to self-sufficiency requires a UK-wide effort? And will he urge the devolved administrations to adopt the provisions of the bill so that farmers across Britain can produce the food that the country needs.
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right that currently the policy, of course, the bill only applies to England. He's completely right, but in a loving and sharing way, in a loving and sharing way, we are going to work with the devolved administrations, Mr. Speaker, so that the whole of the UK can enjoy the benefits.
Sorry, Chaplain.
Mental health support is vital for victims of sexual crimes. When a Rotherham survivor, who's here today, reported her childhood abuse to the police, they told her not to go for counselling as it could be used against her in court. Your Attorney General is challenging the rules, so it's even easier for defence teams to access victims' counselling notes, having an immediate chilling effect. Survivors shouldn't be forced to choose between their mental health and justice. Prime Minister, please stop this.
Well, I'm very interested to hear what she says, and I will look at the evidence that she has. But these are very sensitive and very difficult issues, particularly as regards the defence cases. But if she looks at what's happening, for instance, on rape and serious sexual offences, where we've had very similar problems, we are starting to see gradually an improvement in the prosecution rates, and that is because governments across departments across Whitehall working together to take account of victims' needs. And I agree that progress isn't everything that I would like, but we are seeing progress.
My right honourable friend may be aware that the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust has recently submitted a revised outline business case in support of its £312 million capital allocation made by the Department of Health 4 years ago. Does he agree with me that in order to make progress and complete the ambitious hospital building programme, the NHS decision-making processes not only need to be levelled up, they need to be speeded up?
Prime Minister.
I think, Mr. Speaker, that the right honourable gentleman certainly speaks for many in this House in wanting faster decisions on planning in the NHS. But what you also, and that's what we're doing, we're pushing through, as he knows, 40 hospitals 40 hospitals we are building, Mr. Speaker, and what that needs is the funding. And I just tactfully point out again, the opposition benches bellowing away. They voted against the extra £39 billion that we're putting in.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Mr. Singh's identity has been stolen. His NHS records are being misused, but he's been advised there is nothing the Health Secretary can do. Crimes are being committed in his name. The Home Secretary's department assured him that this would not affect his immigration status. Yet recently, he, his wife and children were detained by UK Border Force whilst travelling for a family holiday. Can the Prime Minister explain who in his government is responsible for this chaotic incompetence?
Mr. Speaker, I'd be only too happy to look at I'm very sorry for the experience that Mr. Singh and his family have had. And I ask who's responsible. I'm responsible, Mr. Speaker, and but I will look at the case. I'll make sure that she gets a proper answer from the Home Office and the Immigration Department.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Dominique Davis, is the niece of Dom Phillips, the British journalist missing in Brazil, alongside the Indigenous expert Bruno Pereira. Will my right honourable friend ensure that the government makes this case a diplomatic priority and that it works to do everything it can to ensure that the Brazilian authorities put the resources necessary to uncover the truth and find out what has happened to Dom and Bruno?
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and I can tell her that for representing the niece of Dom Phillips. And of course, like everybody in this House, we're deeply concerned about what may have happened to him. FCDO officials are working closely now with the Brazilian authorities following his disappearance on the 5th of June. The minister responsible has raised the issue repeatedly, the search and rescue effort with Brazil's Justice and Public Security Minister, and what we've told the Brazilians, Mr. Speaker, is we stand ready to provide, Madam Deputy Speaker, I should say, we stand ready to provide all the support that they may need.
And that brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions. It was quite a noisy, at times messy, PMQs with Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. And I also must just take the opportunity to apologise for a brief shot here in the studio in the middle of Prime Minister's Questions. That was, of course, totally accidental. Time to introduce our guests for this part of the programme. Lucy Fraser for the Government, a Treasury Minister, Preet Gill for the Labour Party, Shadow International Development Minister, and Vicki Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Following last week, Vicki, and the conversation that we had about Keir Starmer's performance and the choice in terms of questions to Boris Johnson following that confidence vote, he did seem to have sort of upped, certainly, his game in terms of performing for his own side as well as the Chamber in general. What did you make of it?
Yes, he did. There was certainly a bit more passion there, wasn't there? And just to go back over last week, of course, lots of people felt that he missed an open goal by not really going for Boris Johnson in a personal way about the confidence vote and about his own integrity and all the rest of it. He talked instead about the NHS. So again, he talked about issues which people will feel are incredibly important. The sort of broader economic performance, really, of the government and of the country. But it was a bit messy, as you say. There was lots of shouting. It didn't quite hit the mark, I think some people might think in all of this. He had a sort of joke about Star Wars, which was a little bit too long, maybe didn't quite get to the point.
And Love Island.
And Love Island. So lots of different things thrown in there, which in the end sort of seemed a bit confusing. So I think there will be some, after a week where we've heard newspaper reports of the Shadow Cabinet suggesting that Keir Starmer is a bit too boring, there will be some saying he's got to focus actually a little bit more on exactly what he's trying to achieve from these things. And I think also it was difficult for him because Boris Johnson was coming back at him again, saying, what are your views on rail strikes? What are your views about immigration policy? And of course, you know, he's not there to answer the questions, but it did make it look as if he didn't have the answers on all of that. So, yeah, a bit messy. Hard to see what the focus was in all of that, I think, for most people watching.
And we'll come back to Labour and Keir Starmer's performance a little later with Preet. But in terms of the cost of living, in terms of some of the lines of questioning on the economy, how much trouble is the government in, do you think?
Well, I think it's a longer-term issue in a way, isn't it? And I suppose there's never one moment where it's going to be, this is the moment where the economy becomes centre stage. It's going to be a gradual thing happening over the next few months. And I think everyone, if you speak to everyone from the Cabinet down, they know it's going to get harder. I think they feel that actually the autumn is going to be much worse than it is now. We're not quite there yet. And the government will come under more and more pressure to come up with some solutions over all of this. And of course, it's all very well to say there's global issues. Of course there are global issues. Every country's being hit. But when you look at those comparisons with other countries, the UK looking worse, that is much harder for the government to find an answer to.
Well, let's ask Lucy Fraser in the Treasury. Why is it that the UK is deemed to have the lowest growth by the OECD next year than other comparable countries?
Well, Vicki's right to highlight that this is a global issue, but you asked me a question about comparators, which is, an important question. But it is relevant to point out that last year we were the fastest growing economy in the G7.
That's because the UK government had contracted the most as well the year before that.
So we come from a point where we had grown significantly.
From a low bar.
So this year we are the second fastest. You're right to say that next year there will be slower growth, but both the OECD and the IMF forecast that by 2024, again, we will be the second joint fastest, and by 2025, we will outpace everyone in the G7.
Right. The thing is that the government, and Boris Johnson in particular, like to cite global pressures and the global picture, and therefore you do reach for the comparator, don't you? I mean, the Institute of Fiscal Studies has questioned and is questioning the £37 billion, it's a lot of money, that the government says is being put into the economy. And they look at the comparison with other countries like Italy, Spain and France when it comes to how much a country's spending to help households with energy bills. Italy at 2%, this is as a percentage of GDP. Spain 1.7%, France 1.5%, the United Kingdom 0.8%.
We've put in £37 billion. And that's through a variety of measures, one of which, I should say, comes into force, which has been announced today, will come in July, and that's the £650. There's significant support. So if you can throw out figures, you can throw out percentages. What people want to know is, what does it mean to them? So let me tell you what it means to them. So the 8 million most vulnerable households will get £1,200 additional direct payments this year. That should equal the costs of the average energy price rise. So that's how we've calculated how much we're going to support people through this very difficult time when energy is one of the most significant costs that are coming through people's bills.
All right, that's a lot of figures. Admittedly, I was the one who started it. But what would Labour do? What would Labour do? It's £37 billion. I'll come to the fact in just a moment that actually the IFS have questioned whether it really is £37 billion when you take into account tax increases. But what would Labour do differently?
Can I just answer the question that you put, because I don't think it's been answered properly. The reason that we are in the position of having high taxes and much weakened public services is because we've had a decade of low growth. I mean, under the previous Labour government, the economy was growing about 2%, would be here now at about 10%. And that's because the government just does not have a grip. I mean, the cost of living crisis, the fact that inflation is at the highest for 40 years. In work is not working. People in work are facing poverty.
But that's what I asked.
How on earth are they going to grow the economy if they've got no money to go out and spend?
Give me some of those ideas, Preet, because I've asked Lucy precisely about those things you've outlined. But Labour has to have some sort of compelling narrative to oppose and offer an alternative. What is it?
You're absolutely right, but I think we are the ones that are leading. That's why we've got a U-turn on a government that's taken our windfall tax offer and provided that. There are three clear measures that we need to do. We need to stabilise the economy, making sure that it is working for everyone. You've got to support businesses, and that's the emergency budget that we were talking about. You've got to have an industrial strategy. You've got to think about how do you transition our economy to net zero by creating jobs. There are more people in out-of-work benefits not seeking work at the moment.
Well,
there are
the
more
employment
vacancies
but the employment
in the
figures, the employment figures tell a different story, don't they?
There are more vacancies in the labour market. The government's not helping. We will help people get back into work.
How?
That's what people need is support. You've got to look at the employment reform. You've got to look at measures that are going to absolutely tackle and provide people with the opportunities to get training, to get the jobs that we are talking about. You've got to insulate homes. You've got to help people by acting now. Actually, the failure of the government of not investing in an energy strategy is costing us about £9 billion. They could have done this last year. Last September, we'd be on track by the end of the year to have insulated 2 million homes.
That is a long-term. That is a long-term strategy.
The 19 million is a long-term strategy.
Would you say that people feel well off at the moment? Would you say that they feel comfortable about their futures and confident that they are going to be able to afford continuing rising energy bills, even with that investment?
Look, there's no denying that it's a very challenging time and people are going to feel that. You know, I know that from talking to people in my constituency. I know that from talking to people more widely. But that's why we have constantly responded to the pressures that they face at the time when they are the pinch points. So the spring statement announced a variety
Which went down really quite badly, didn't it?
Well, we announced there was support to those people who were working by cutting their tax bill. Then the Chancellor came back more recently, once we knew what the Ofgem estimates were for the increases in energy, put a further £15 billion to support those low-income families, those most vulnerable people. He did a package for the most vulnerable people on low incomes, for pensioners, as well as those with disabilities, and everybody. So everybody will get an extra £400.
Would you expect the Chancellor to come back again before the autumn, if need be?
I think the Chancellor keeps this under constant review.
Right. I mean, the alternative vision from the Labour Party, I know you're in opposition, it is difficult to set out a sort of manifesto, if you like, line by line. But at the moment, there hasn't been a promise by Labour to reverse the increase in national insurance contributions that you are so against. Why not?
Look, we've got to look at what we're going to inherit. I mean, my goodness, the government's got at its disposal civil servants working for them. We don't know what the level of concerns are within the department. And, of course, you know, every time you ask questions, this is a government that avoids transparency, doesn't give you any answers. And so we don't know what we are going to inherit. It is not the right time, as you said, the only G7 nation to be increasing taxes. This is not supporting people. The British public don't feel, actually, that the government is doing enough to support them. And as you said, Jo, there is going to be more increase in energy bills next year, £800. When are we going to get an emergency budget that is absolutely going to address the concerns that people are facing with huge energy crisis, food shortages, and, of course, if we have a rail strike, that'll be 40%. It will impact the economy.
Are you supporting the strikes?
No, of course I'm not supporting the strike, but this is of the government's making. We have a government that is not leading. It is the Labour Party, given all the U-turns that we've had in the last 2 years, that are the ones that are offering the solutions, that are the ones that are getting the government to U-turn and leading, actually, is what I would say.
Right, so you'd condemn the strikes?
I absolutely think that given that the country is facing a cost of living crisis, the British public cannot face this level of disruption. We can't face it for the economy, and we certainly can't face it for people's life. This is of the government's making. They haven't been in talks. They've had huge amounts of opportunity to negotiate this. What do you expect from a government in Britain, a government that actually is there negotiating on behalf of the British public, not stoking and creating, manufacturing constant arguments on issues that are not necessary?
I mean, it's a complete failure of statecraft, though, isn't it, by the government? Because these strikes are going to go ahead, disrupt the country. But go on.
Can I just say I condemn the strikes? I didn't hear Preet say she condemned the strikes.
I said I condemned the strike. Keir Starmer has said I condemned the strikes. But the problem we have is that...
I've heard it.
So I heard that. I didn't hear Lisa Nandy say that. And I didn't hear Wes Streeting say that.
Well, Preet's here, a member of the Shadow Cabinet, and she's condemned those strikes.
And can I just say, because you asked about what Labour would do, Labour have not said, in fact, they said they would not take away the health and social care levy. And what Labour have also said is they've committed, they've announced £100 billion worth of tax cuts without saying where any of them are going, how any of them are going to be funded.
Well, certainly the Prime Minister talked about how much we have costed all the pledges that we made, so he seems to have the detail, and maybe you ought to speak to him at the end of the day. We have been providing a very credible offer as the opposition, and that's the reason that you're actually taking all of our ideas and having to implement them. You know, the windfall tax, I mean, you've had to be bought kicking and screaming to absolutely accept that this was the right thing to do. And now, rather than actually, you know, using taxpayers' money wisely, you're actually giving it to people that own second and third homes and then saying, oh, by the way, you can give it away to charity. It's not your decision to tell how we should spend taxpayers' money. It's important that it's directed at those that need it the most. That's supporting the British public. I'm sorry, you're not doing that.
The windfall tax was proposed by Labour in January, at a time when we didn't know what the energy price rise was going to be. The windfall tax that we have
But you did U-turn on it.
Well, what the Chancellor has repeatedly said, actually, was that he wasn't minded to do a windfall tax. What he wanted to see instead was investment by the oil and gas companies. And what he brought in was not Labour's windfall tax. What he actually brought in was a tax, but which you would get investment relief from if you did invest. So it's a much more sophisticated tax, which we will be bringing forward to ensure that we do get the investment that we need in those industries.
All right, well, let's talk. I said we would talk about leadership, Keir Starmer's leadership. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader, thinks Keir Starmer is too loyal. He needs to put some more welly in it. Is she right?
Well, look, you know, the British public understand that we are facing very difficult and serious situations, not only in the country, but globally. And that requires a leader that is very serious, that takes these issues very seriously. It's not about having a laugh and joke at the dispatch box and trying to have, you know, strap lines just to cover everything. And Keir, what's really clear about Keir is he really cares about the state of the economy and the position that Britain finds itself. And so he's a leader that's transformed the Labour Party under him. He's addressed anti-Semitism. He has put Labour back on track to have a hearing with the British public. And nobody expected after the 2019 results that actually we, based on the election results now, are on the course to actually win a general election. So I think, actually, let's give him some credit about the things that he has been able to do, given the challenges he faced.
It's the Shadow Cabinet, or members of the Shadow Cabinet themselves, maybe including you, who don't seem to be giving him as much credit as you might. I mean, it's reported... Well, I know you fully back him, but it's reported this morning that he told the Shadow Cabinet to stop briefing the press, that he's boring. Were you at that meeting?
Of course I was at the Shadow Cabinet, and let me tell you, that is not my style to go and speak to the press. I have huge confidence in Keir Starmer. That's the reason I backed him. He is bringing integrity back into British politics. That's absolutely what he's need. He has got a plan for making Britain the best place to live and work in. And you know what? I think we've got to give him some credit about the things that he has done, actually. Nobody thought the Labour Party would be in the current position that we have. We will be setting out our policy stall. Of course, no party does that way before a general election.
Did he tell you to stop briefing the press that he's boring?
Look, at the end of the day, what he's saying and holding his shadow cabinet to account, if you've got something to say, come and say it. I actually would say that there's a real concern about those people that feel they have to go and talk to others as opposed to the leader of their party. That speaks more about them.
Well, Preet is setting out that Keir Starmer is offering a different style of leadership, one of integrity, more honest. Is that the reason, do you think, Lucy, that polling company Redfern and Wilton say that Labour is leading by 10 points over the Tories in red wall seats, those seats previously held by the Labour Party, won for the first time? They're losing faith.
I think what people will judge us on at the next election is our policy delivery. Have we affected the lives of people for the better? Have we delivered on what we promised? And I think that Boris Johnson has made some pretty tough, bold calls in the right direction. You know, he mentioned some of them at PMQs. You know, the first one was obviously Brexit. The only person who could have delivered Brexit was him, and he did it.
Right, he's also the first Prime Minister to have found to be breaking the law and be issued with a fixed penalty notice.
I think what people will judge us on when it comes to polling day, whenever that is, in due course, will be, you know, did we get through COVID? Were the right calls made on COVID? Did we get the vaccine? Were we the first country to do that and roll it out? Are we tackling immigration?
Ignore the rest.
Well, are we tackling immigration? Something that really does concern a lot of people up and down the country. Are we tackling the cost of living? We've touched on the cost of living. These are the things that matter to people at the end of the day, and I think that that's what we will be judged on.
All right, well, we'll talk to you in just a moment about how successful it is in terms of stopping those crossings by people over the channel, because so far it's not working. On that issue, I can see there in the chamber Yvette Cooper standing up, no doubt responding to whatever Priti Patel has said over this issue. But how important is it for the government in terms of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about delivery actually is the right one. And I think the big question for the government is, at the moment, it's not working in practical terms. That flight last night couldn't take off. It's who people will ultimately blame for that. Now, obviously, the government is pointing to the court in Strasbourg and saying, and there are lots of Tory MPs saying it's time to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. They want changes around all of that. But the question is whether, actually, is it the government that needs to come up with a policy that is workable, that does, you know, go along with the European Convention on Human Rights? Is it up to them to come up with something that is actually practically doesn't cost an awful lot of money? You know, I think at the moment people might be looking at it and going, well, they've tried and they're being thwarted. But actually, as the months go by, I think people will want to know, actually, how are you going to deliver on all of this? It's not enough just to you know, keep talking about it and blaming other people. But, you know, I think it's a dividing line, isn't it? And it's a very clear dividing line when it comes between Labour and the Conservatives on all of this.
Well, let's have a listen to what Priti Patel, or some of what she's been saying.
While this decision by the Strasbourg court to intervene was disappointing and surprising, given the repeated and considered judgments to the contrary in our domestic courts, we remain committed to this policy. These repeated legal barriers are, Madam Deputy Speaker, very similar to those that we experience with all other removal flights, and we believe that we are fully compliant with our domestic and international obligations.
Remain committed to the policy, Lucy Fraser. So far, the number of migrants taken to Rwanda is 0. Yesterday, at least 444 people crossed the channel. The aim of this policy is to deter people from making that crossing. As things stand, it's not going to deter anyone, is it?
Well, if the policy is successful, which we believe it will be, we believe it will be a deterrence. The thing is that we've got to come back to why are we doing this? Why have we put in place?
Because you failed on every other attempt you've made to actually deal with it.
The reason it's a very, very, very challenging issue. When people want to come here, it's very challenging to tackle that. There are tens of thousands of people coming every year, taking a dangerous journey from a safe country, from France, organised by criminal gangs, and we need to tackle that because the numbers are going up, they're not going down, and we are tackling that.
Right, well, you say you are tackling that, but as I say, so far, right, one flight, it hasn't gone, no one's gone to Rwanda. The spend so far cost $500,000 to charter the plane that didn't leave the ground, and you've made a £120 million upfront payment to Rwanda. You're in the Treasury. So far, would you say that was good value for money?
So this isn't a question about cost. This is a question about people's lives, people making a dangerous journey. You can't put a cost on that. But if you want to talk about money, we spend £1.5 billion a year on our asylum system, and we spend about £5 million a day on hotel fees. So it is the current system is extremely expensive. And so but that's not the reason to look at this. One of the reasons to look at it is because we want to stop people making this dangerous journey when they're in a safe country.
I mean, looking at it from the legal perspective, Preet, the Supreme Court, the High Court, the Court of Appeal all said this flight could take off. Were you pleased to see the European Court intervene at the last moment?
Look, at the end of the day, whatever the legal position
on
those cases, of course it is, but I don't know the detail of those individual cases.
But broadly, were you pleased to see the European Court intervene and overrule for the moment?
What I think is really important is the misinformation that's been provided to the British public. Is this going to address smuggler gangs? No, it is not. Is this value for money? No, it is not.
How do you know, though? Because it hasn't actually taken off.
Because, as you said, nobody has actually gone, but we have, put out this money of 500,000. We had to get that plane there, and originally it was for 37 people. Can you justify spending £500,000 of taxpayers' money for 37 people? No, you absolutely cannot.
All right, very briefly, because we've only got
the backlog. The reason we're in this mess, let's just be clear, is because Priti Patel is presiding over a department which has got a huge backlog. So what she's actually saying is we'll take years to do your claims and we'll charge the taxpayer.
All right.
We won't let people work, and we'll support you and we'll give you B&B.
Obviously, that is not.
I've got to give
that is why
Lucy
we are here,
a chance to respond because we've only got 20 seconds or so.
Well, obviously, that's not why we're in the position.
Well, invest in the police. Why are you cutting the National Crime Agency?
Well, if you want to know, well, the reason we're in this position is people are making this dangerous journey from France to this country.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you to all of my guests for today. Brought us to the end of the programme. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live, and thank you to Vicki Young too from all of us here. Bye-bye.